So, as Brian said, I started the year looking for answers to what journalists mean when they talk about engagement. So I'll share with you some of what I found. But one of the first things I set out to do was figure out what other industries mean when they talk about engagement. This concept is pretty new in journalism. It's not at all new elsewhere. So a very smart doctoral student and I, Maria Garcia, who's sitting in the back, hello, surveyed a bunch of other disciplines, and here are some of the words that other folks mean when they talk about engagement. Attention, involvement, investment, you can see. At the bottom is a bit.ly link to a document that just went up a couple of days ago that is Maria's summation of what we found in other industries when it comes to engagement, so feel free to check that out. I also had an undergraduate student work with me doing interviews in other industries and disciplines. She talked to folks in museums about the concept of participatory museums, nonprofits. She has a piece ready to go up about active patients and how what was a passive relationship between doctor and patient is becoming more active and what journalists can learn from that. So we did a lot of these sort of surveys of what it means elsewhere. The most important thing to start with when we talk about what engagement means to journalism is that I mean something different by it than time on site and eyeballs and attention. When journalists talk about engagement, very often what we mean is how much of people's attention have they given us, and it still is quite a passive relationship. When I mean engagement, I mean from the perspective of the journalist, how are we focused on audience? How are we motivating a deeper connection, and how are we motivating more participation? So I interviewed dozens of journalists and kept a spreadsheet going of what they told me engagement meant and what strategies they were employing to have a more engaged relationship with their community. By the way, there are more and more of these professional journalists whose job titles involve something like engagement, outreach, social media, etc. So those are a lot of the folks I've spent my time talking to. So I moved around the pieces on the spreadsheet until I found themes. One of my goals was to suggest more specific words. So these are the three themes I have been grouping my engagement strategies underneath: outreach, conversation, and collaboration. And I'm going to show you some examples of each of those. First, I want to talk about why engagement is a good idea, why it makes sense, and why it matters. First, it's good for the community. Many of us got into journalism with altruistic notions of making the community a better place through information. It's the right thing to do. It's service-oriented. Knowing the information needs that we think we're serving seems like a practical approach to take as a journalist. It's also good for the bottom line. I don't think too many businesses would disagree with the idea that being in touch with and responsive to our audience and our customers is important. We want to know why people turn to us, what they want from us, how we can help them. Part of the idea of a measurement of success is knowing what we value about interactions and who else might benefit. So understanding the audience is key. It's also good for the journalism. Having the audience more involved, more in mind, makes the journalism better. We can do things together that we couldn't do on our own. And engagement helps us be more in touch, more comprehensive in our coverage, and just more present. The key with this is to understand what we're working toward. Journalism is not a monolithic idea. Think about the difference between a regional public radio station, an advocacy journalism organization, a community weekly, and a national newspaper. We have to know exactly what we're striving for so that we can know if we're succeeding. What is the mission? What does your brand stand for? Is it community problem solving? Is it more discussion? Are you hoping for more brand awareness? Do you want help deciding what's important to cover? Are you looking to bring more eyeballs to your website? For advertisers, know exactly what you're hoping to do. One of the most important facets of engagement, I think, for journalists to understand is the concept of listening. And I don't mean listening in terms of as part of a journalistic interview. I mean listening to what customers and media consumers and users want. Corporations have gotten very, very smart about this. This is an article about Dell's social media listening command center, and here's a quote from it, or a statistic. Average daily mentions of Dell on Twitter alone have a greater reach than the combined circulation of the top 12 daily US newspapers. Mentions of one brand on Twitter reach more people. So Dell has clearly decided that it is worth the investment to listen to the chatter around their brand, partly as customer service. I've gotten great customer service on Twitter, and partly in terms of brand perception. So Nonprofits are getting very smart about this also, but corporations understand that if people are talking about your product or issues related to your product, you should be there. If people are talking about your community or issues, whether they're talking about your journalism or just issues related to the community, you should be there listening, contributing, and problem solving. We actually just heard this at lunch during the Yaya presentation, right? Businesses know that they need to be present and listening where the customers actually are. So one real transformation that journalists have to make is understanding that it's not just about the content. It's not just about the what. Journalists are great at the what. Journalists have the craft of journalism figured out. We've got to incorporate into there an understanding of how the product is going to be consumed. So it's not just about putting up a sign saying, hey, we have great stuff, we're doing great journalism, come check us out. You have to go where people are and prod them to consume, to talk, to listen, to share, and to contribute. We also heard this at lunch, fish where the fish are, which I think is fantastic. Fish where the fish are. We're making journalism. Are we taking it to people where they already are, where they want and need it? So, outreach, conversation, collaboration. I want to acknowledge that a lot of these ideas have been around. The public journalism movement, in large part, took on the idea that journalists could be part of community problem solving through deeper connections and more conversations with the community, and in a lot of cases it worked. You could also say that some of what I'm about to show you are just the basic premise of good beat reporting and listening to a community. But I want to show you some examples of what's possible these days and how some legacy news organizations, startup news organizations are taking advantage of today's participatory culture and some digital tools and some good old-fashioned non-digital stuff to have craft a different relationship with their community. Outreach. Perhaps the biggest takeaway I have this year is the idea that journalists need to have a specific audience in mind and go find them. California Watch is an investigative news network in California, and they spend quite a bit of time thinking about content distribution for specific audiences. This package on shaky ground looked at the seismic safety of public schools in California. As part of that project, long series, lots of traditional journalism forms, they decided that one of their audiences was the elementary school student, and so they made a coloring book that broke down the issues of seismic safety. The goal being, how are we improving lives through information? Do people know how to be safe, what to do in case of an emergency? The coloring book was translated into 4 languages, and with the help of the public schools, distributed to school kids. The Voice of San Diego has this amazing example of outreach, a 6-month project on the life of a refugee who was deaf and unable to speak. Their engagement editor, Grant Barrett, who's an alum of Mizzou, reached out to refugee and refugee rights groups, to the deaf community, and to the public services community. He says, we are carefully finding individuals and groups who, if they did not hear about these stories, would be worse off for it. If the goal is to do journalism that changes lives, which lives most need changing? And are we finding them? So he's quick to point out that the approach is not right for every story. Every bitty news story does not need an outreach strategy. But in general, it's something we need to be considering. The Chicago Tribune surprised me when I called them this fall to ask about outreach strategy because they wanted to talk all about in-person events and how they are reaching out, hosting meetups at bars, hosting panel discussions, hosting big events that people pay to come to so that they can then have wine and cheese afterwards with the panelists and the journalists. They have partnered with the Second City Comedy Troupe to do interviews on stage as part of comedy acts. They see that as a distribution channel, the same as broadcasting a radio show. How are we connecting with our community, experiencing together the collective experience of Chicago? How is that reflected in what we're doing? And how are we making more personal a very large newspaper brand? I spent some time a couple of weeks ago in the newsroom of the Register Citizen in Torrington, Connecticut. This is what you see when you come in. They have put a newsroom cafe and lounge area in there. They moved into a new building so that they can invite the community into the space. They have a classroom that communities can use, meeting spaces. They're providing training for the community. They are basically trying to turn the newsroom into a town hangout place and resource. They invested in a fancy archive machine that's really easy to use and free to use, so people pop into the newsroom to use the archive machine, to get a cup of coffee, to look through the archives, to attend a class on the First Amendment or digital photography. And they're hoping to get more and more people through the door. Category number 2, conversation. I love this quote. And I think I stole it from Jay Rosen. I didn't steal the quote, but he brought my attention to it. The idea that where people are having conversations, there is an opportunity for journalism. Where people are connecting around common interests and wish to discuss it, there is an opportunity for a journalist to contribute or to enable. This is an example of how the Washington Post did that on this year's anniversary of 9/11. A simple hashtag, "Where were you?" on Twitter, and thousands of people contribute where they were on the morning of 9/11. People would be talking about it anyway. A journalist putting a frame on it and collecting it turns it into an experience that transcends you and your network. Screenshot of KOMU on Facebook. KOMU TV here in Columbia does a great job of interacting with people on Facebook and listening. Paying attention to what people are saying around your brand, providing them a place to say it, paying attention and jumping in. Forward on or validate useful comments that people make, answer questions, provide a newsroom, a window into how the newsroom works and the news is conducted. I've had a capstone team from Mike McKean's class this year working with me on some Facebook strategies for the Missourian. What are the best practices? What are we hoping to accomplish? Is it more eyeballs? Is it traffic back to the site? Is it conversation? Is it interaction? And how do we know if we're achieving it? The Civil Beat is a startup in Honolulu that hosts, their reporters are called reporter hosts, and they are in charge of the conversation that surrounds their beats. They host what they call beat-ups, which are serious conversations around issues like energy and water. They just had one on prostitution in Hawaii. So it's actually the beat reporter who covers this. It's that person's job to invite people and convene a conversation around the issue. John Temple is their editor. He was at the Rocky Mountain News before it folded, and he says we want to be the trusted friend of the audience. And inviting people to the conversation and making the conversation smarter is one way that they're trying to do that. The St. Louis Beacon does a great job of this. They have a series called Race Frankly, and they host bi-weekly chats at different spots around the community. Sometimes they get 3 people, sometimes they get a dozen people, but the goal is to get people talking about an issue that's tough to talk about. The Beacon also does this in more general terms, not with specific coverage in mind, but they have something called Beacon and Eggs, which I just find charming beyond belief, Beacon and Eggs. But they're like monthly breakfasts, and they take it around the city and look for ways that they can help the community connect with the Beacon as kind of a node. So, conversation. Collaboration. This is a drawing I recreated from Meg Pickard at The Guardian, who has an anthropology background but is now the engagement editor there. I think that's her title. She says that journalists are used to working before publication, and they work and they work and they work until they're ready for publication. They hit publish, they go back to the beginning. That's when the community comes in, and they react and they share and they talk and they consume in this separate space. And the two empty quadrants are the real untapped potential. Meg said that she knew she was doing her job at The Guardian when everybody in the newsroom started drawing this back to her. At The Guardian, they call it mutualization, and the entire staff had to go through mutualization conversation training. This is a quote from the editor of The Guardian. "We feel as if we are edging towards a new world in which we bring important things to the table, we as journalists. Editing, reporting, areas of expertise, access, a title or brand that people trust, ethical professional standards, and an extremely large community of readers. The members of that community could not hope to aspire to anything like that audience or reach on their own. They bring us a rich diversity, specialist expertise, and on-the-ground reporting that we couldn't possibly hope to achieve without including them in what we do." So the idea is, what can we do together that we couldn't possibly do on our own? So let's walk through some collaboration examples. Really simple way to invite input and feedback is report the error spots on websites, which more and more sites are doing. Some, I believe this is from the Registered Citizen in Connecticut on the bottom, some say, can we contact you in the future? Thank you for reporting the error in our story. Can we get in touch with you next time we're doing this? Which reminds me a whole lot of the goals of the Public Insight Network in Minnesota, which is doing such interesting work in crowdsourcing and realizing that people are an expertise in their own experience, and how do we, as news organizations, tap into that when we need it, instead of flying in when there's a crisis. How do we gather the database of people who are willing to talk to us and who have expertise they're willing to share? So in terms of being an expertise in your own experience, this is a map from the snowstorms from the Chicago Tribune in January, where they asked people to contribute information about, I think it was whether roads were plowed. I'm sorry, I don't have the specifics on the tip of my tongue, but it's basically, we want information about neighborhoods. I was in a very similar situation here, wishing during the snowstorm when I was caught in my house that I could understand my route to campus and whether I could get here safely. So the idea that we could not possibly hope to cover the city and provide real-time reports of the snowplow situation on our own. But if we invite people to contribute, they have motivation to do so, and we create something we couldn't do on our own. See, Click, Fix is another really interesting example of this, inviting people to report problems in their neighborhood. The founder, Ben Berkowitz, likes to say that potholes are the gateway drug to civic engagement. You get people to report on potholes, and immediately they're more connected and engaged with their surroundings, and they feel empowered to do something about it. Really, really interesting organization. They make widgets. This is from the Boston.com. The Washington Post uses it. Dallas Morning News uses it. Very neighborhood specific. The West Seattle blog takes news tips via text message 24 hours a day. I think news organizations have a lot to learn about being approachable and accessible. If people want to contribute, do we make it clear all the ways there are to do this? I did some interesting looking this year at the nonprofit world's ladder of participation and how you show how you move to the next level of engagement, the next level of investment in something. The Rapidian in Grand Rapids has an example of that on their own site. You want to be involved? Let me spell out for you the ways you can do that, from passively reading to contributing a story to contributing an idea, sharing, evangelizing on the part of the brand. They also, at the West Seattle blog, write conversationally and transparently about what they know and don't know. And in the writing style, they invite contribution. So if they hear something, they're going to put up a post saying, hey, we heard this is going on, we're looking into it. At the same time that they're looking into it, other people find it and jump on and say, hey, well, here's what I know. And by the time they come back, a good chunk of the story has been told for them. Making it clear in your general approach, in your interface, that you want involvement and that there are easy ways to get in touch. And then there are projects built entirely on collaboration, like the Rapidian in Grand Rapids, like My Missourian here in Columbia, sites focused on citizen journalism, or like Davis Wiki, a true wiki site that exists because people invest in it and have motivation to, and feel like it's part of the community good. Another aspect of collaboration is letting people tell their own stories. This project at the Washington Post is one of the hardest things I've read in a while about a tragic birth story and health problems that resulted. And the reporter found out about it because somebody in his network was Facebook friends with somebody in this network, and they told the story by curating Facebook posts and responses from this mother's Facebook. What you see in the orange is the reporter jumping in to explain relationships and context. Sometimes letting people tell their own stories, again, everybody's an expert in their own experience, can be the most powerful way, and being open to that and having a system in the newsroom that allows for that. Journalists are creatures of habit, and our habit and routines need to expand to involve more interaction, more focus on audience throughout. So here's what else I'm working on. I'm hosting an event here next week called the Engagement Metric, where we're going to talk about attaching measurable value to engagement strategies. What's the value and payoff of engagement? So what we're going to do is say, list out what community conversation is and looks like, all the ways that manifests, and then pick some of those and list what the journalist and the community get out of it. What's the value? And then how can we measure that? Is it subscriptions? Is it time on site? Is it registrations? Is it solution for community problems? You have to know what you're going for. On the topic of measurement, I want to also say this, that I think journalists need to get much smarter about evaluating the effects of everything they do. What's the strategy in this coverage? What's the strategy in this staffing arrangement? What's the goal, and is it being met? That's true whether we're looking at beat coverage and reporter assignments, or whether we're looking at investing in audience interaction. I absolutely agree that in order to value engagement, we need to be able to measure it and its effectiveness, but I would also say that that's true about the rest of the room. I'm working on a newsroom discussion guide to talk about engagement, a tool for newsrooms to identify what their goals and priorities are, and then here are the questions to ask yourself about how that actually manifests. One thing I found as I talked to journalists this year is that few of them disagree with some of the basic questions and premises. So if you ask a journalist, do you want your community to feel like you're approachable, to be able to get in touch? Journalists are not going to really say no very often. But then you follow that with a list of, so what do you actually do to make it clear to the communities the ways they can get in touch and contribute to what you're doing? And that it gets trickier. So I'm working on a discussion guide to help newsrooms have that conversation. And then, together with Ken Fleming, we did a survey of 500 daily newspaper editors. So I want to show you a little bit about what we learned about what editors are actually doing now. We surveyed managing editors and executive editors of daily community newspapers. 100,000 circulation and under. 83 of them were less than 25,000 circulation, 10% 25 to 50, and 7% 50 to 100. Most of the editors were responsible for both online and print, but interestingly, 35% of them are still responsible just for print. And in terms of interest in the topic, 89% of them, I guess we always ask, do you want to receive a copy of the results of the survey, and 89% said they did. It's interesting. So we asked people about their current level of involvement with their community. 44% of them plan to increase their involvement in the community over the next 12 months. Here are some of the open-ended responses they gave us when we asked that question. I think we've gone through a period of consolidation and are coming out of it. We've recognized that we need to increase our closeness with the community. We're getting geared up to be more involved by hiring someone who will be required to take on that responsibility. You over there, talk to the audience. More of the readers are looking at the newspaper as something they own. Keeping the paper relevant and local is a factor. And engagement is what's necessary to survive in this economy. Nearly 9 out of 10 newsrooms talk about how to make the news more social or participatory. Interesting. Again, the problem is that we don't know what they mean by that, but they're talking about it. So one of the questions we asked, this was actually at the end of the survey, after they had heard sort of what we mean about this and all these specific questions, one of the things we asked was, how important are these 3 kinds of engagement? So how important is community outreach in your newsroom? Here's some of the open-ended answers we got. I think we have to move beyond the passive reader and get people engaged. When people go to the web, they often want to be engaged or respond to a story, pass that story on to somebody else. To keep our readers, we have to engage them and have a 2-way conversation, not a 1-way conversation. Woohoo! If we're not attached to the community, what purpose do we really serve? And without the community, we're dead in the water. We asked how important is being in conversation with your community. The future is going to be interactive, and that means conversation. If we fail to listen, we fail to be aware of what's going on, and we will cease to exist. How important is collaboration with your community? We can't do it all, particularly with the limitations of our staff. If we collaborate with the community, they can help be our eyes and ears. Several of the respondents mentioned being understaffed, which I find really interesting, this idea that a focus on audience is born somewhat out of desperation in distressing economic times. It seems like the thing to do was another answer, which I just love. I'm not quite sure what it means, but people are talking about it, and it seems like the thing to do. So there were, of the 3, the outreach, conversation, collaboration, the collaboration got less enthusiastic responses, but we still, looking through the 500 open-ended responses, and I haven't done it real carefully yet, but I was not finding answers that said it was a bad thing to do. They're just not really sure what it means and not sure just how vital it is. We asked them about seeking input from their audience. 8 out of 10 say that they seek input from the audience about what to cover. 2/3 invite the audience to contribute information to add to existing stories. 8 out of 10 of them do that at least once a week. Smaller papers in general solicit contributions more than big papers in terms of, hey, what's your story? What's going on in your life? We want you to share it with us so we can publish it. 3/4 of those newspapers say that they do that at least once a week. Remember, these are all dailies too, not weekly papers. Big papers, however, solicit contributions more on their own terms. We want your input and expertise about this thing we're already working on, which is in contrast to the smaller papers that say, sure, whatever you got. And 6 out of 10 of them say that they ask for help reporting specific stories at least once a week. So then we asked them about participation in the comment sections of their paper. Bigger papers do it more than smaller papers. Many expressed hesitation here about whether it's appropriate and whether it's appropriate to talk back when people are talking to you in the comment section, and also whether it would cause more trouble than it's worth in terms of moderation and in terms of making a problem worse by jumping in and sort of defending it or adding fuel to the fire. 3/4 of newspapers interact with the audience online, and this is in the comment section at least once a week. So one way that journalists can listen to their communities is web analytics, and I don't think a lot of newsrooms are putting them to the deep, sophisticated use that they are good for. 9 out of 10 say that they get reports regularly about the traffic on their sites, what's getting the most traffic, where the source of the traffic, and that sort of thing. Larger newsrooms are more likely than smaller newsrooms to actually use those reports in making news decisions. So, general highlights. Editors are thinking about making the news more social and participatory. They see engagement as part of good business. A lot of times it's tied to the economy, and they're saying we should do this because otherwise we're sunk. What they mean by engagement can be very specific and narrow, and I think that it's important that we as an industry talk more about what the possible strategies are, what we value in them, what the goals of it are, and how we know if we're moving the needle and succeeding at all. So my contact information is here, along with Ken Fleming's, who did the survey, if you guys have questions about that to follow up on. And I sped through things. Which is good, because we have time to chat, no? Let's chat. What do you want to know? What should we talk about? Yes, so let's chat, let's engage, use your little buttons. What do you got to say, Michael?
So, Joy,
yes.
this is wonderful.
Why, thank you.
This is wonderful, and it's great to kind of see the results of your thinking, the survey, and everything. I'd like to take you to the dark side.
Okay.
You know, after a year of doing this, what worries you? You know, what frustrates you? What do you think is kind of not going to work?
Not going to work?
Not just, you know, what are we missing? I mean,
yeah.
You know, as someone who's been talking about engagement for 8 years, you know, these are encouraging, but it's been 8 years. I don't know. Just what bothers you about what you've learned?
Well, a few things bother me. One is that I have spent the year talking to people who you might have have already drunk the engagement Kool-Aid, and so I'm always surprised. Jen and I joke about this because I haven't spent much time trying to convince people who don't get it. So the fact that the value of a focus on audience is not seen is really disturbing. I worry about the general terms in which we talk about this, because I think that unless we know exactly what we're trying to achieve, we're not going to get anywhere. So all of the editors saying, yes, of course, that's a great idea, are not focused enough to know what we're doing. I worry a lot about measurement. I worry a lot. I went to probably 3 different sessions at South by Southwest this year that claimed to have something to do with an ROI for social media. You know, return on investment, that's great and all, but that's my point about the whole newsroom. What's the return of investment of covering city council? What's the return on investment of weather? You know, which you know, some of those things we can do some surveys and figure out what they mean to people, but investing in the community, it just is, this is part of the problem of having spent my year drinking Kool-Aid, because it's really hard for me to speak the language of people who don't yet get it. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and let me share kind of where some of my frustrations are, is that, I'm right in the middle of a strategic process where I'm leading a group about engagement. And the very first thing we did is, what do we mean by engagement? And everyone, of course, was different. But journalists so often talk about people engaging with our content. And I think that definitionally that's one of the problems, is that we think if we write an engaging article, if we find an engaging story, that is engagement. Right. And so I've come, and with this group in discussing, to say anything that's passive audience, no matter how brilliant the story, no matter how many awards it wins, we will not consider engagement. The only thing we will consider engagement is if someone actually takes an action. Yeah. Some of those we can monitor, some of those we can't. So an action might be telling someone at a cocktail party about the piece. Right. And those are harder to get at. I'm not going to say off the table. Mm-hmm. But I think, I think a lot of the rosiness that I see here about people saying, oh yes, we do this, we ask this. You ask, and you may, get comments, but I think just that notion that fundamentally engagement is about measuring impact. And I think in journalism, we've really substituted audience for impact. Huh. And that changing that view is fundamentally scary. Yeah. Because, we've just, and the technology wasn't there or whatever, but we talk about reach, not knowing, we know the circulation of a newspaper, but don't have a clue whether someone just read the sports scores and nothing else. Right. And so I think that's still the challenge, that everyone gets the buzzword. Right. Yes, we've got to engage, but.
Well, and one important distinction is the engagement the means or the end? For some organizations, if it's a public radio station that has a grant to help fix a problem in the community, then help fixing the problem and the conversations around that might be the point. If, the editor of the Register Citizen in Torrington, the publisher, where they have the community coffee shop, would say it's all about better stories. Everything we're doing here is to make better stories. So, different goals, but you got to know exactly what you are trying to do. Clyde?
Joy, I also really enjoyed this, but one of the early measures of engagement that we used was the number of comments that come in on our online stories. And just in the last month or two, people who are working on paywalls have started to wonder, because the comments go down and they realize that they were getting lots of comments, but they were from the same people. Yeah, or they were bad. They were bad, but part of this whole thing is our measure of it, right. Are we looking at online interactivity and engagement and not really seeing engagement with the masses? Right. And maybe those folks who are saying, oh no, now I don't have any comments because they've cut off a small number of people, what recommendation would you give them? Well, again, you have to know what the purpose is. If you want more comments, that's a very separate goal from we want more thoughtful comments, which is a very separate goal from we want more discussion. If you want the same people going back and forth and debating issues, there are ways to track that. How quickly and how often do people come back? How closely are they following the conversation? There are ways to track whether you're going for repeat, whether you have a core audience you're trying to get to participate more with you online, or whether you're hoping to get more and more people. The idea of unique visitors versus core audience is being talked about a lot. So yeah, comments go down if you require real names. Comments go down when you make people log in with Facebook. But you have to know whether, in a lot of cases, I think that works really well.
I was going to talk about this, tomorrow, but I think it kind of fits here. So I want to pull back a little bit and think about those people who don't get it, and even the people who think they do get it. Because if the question is, why are you doing this? I think the answer is, if journalism is going to remain viable and relevant and accountable, we don't have any choice. Right. And when Ken Doctor spoke yesterday, he said something to the effect that we are the best recommenders to each other of what to read today. Mm-hmm.
We meaning journalists, or we meaning?
Well, see, that is precisely the question. If Walter Williams said that, he certainly would mean professional journalists.
Right.
Ken Doctor meant all of us.
Right.
Everybody.
Right.
If in fact we're in a world where we are the best recommenders to each other of what to read today, what does that tell journalists about where the question they face in terms of their relevance and viability and accountability? It just seems to me that that is such a powerful notion about how different the journalism of the future needs to be than it is today. And clearly engagement is going to be on their terms, not our terms.
Right, and that's a big part of what I mean by outreach, considering the distribution. If your goal, Grant Barrett at the Voice of San Diego, when they wrote a story about a profile of a horseshoer, he went and found the horseshoer listserv or discussion group and got the links sent around. When he considers a lot when who is going to most want the story and who are the influencers in that group of people, and you get a couple of people to think that it's cool, and they'll do your sharing for you. Where are people already talking about this? Journalists have, in terms of enabling people with common interests to talk, we've figured it out in some cases, the mom sites, discussion boards, the community calendar, what information do people need to live their lives today, and where are they looking for it? But we have not figured out how to harness the power of a community like that to distribute, react to, contribute to news.
It sounds like one of your assumptions here is that news organizations should be doing this because it's a good thing to do, not just because there's a business value in it.
Right.
In your travels and examining for-profit concerns that are doing engagement, how do they feel about it? Are they doing it for good, or are they doing it because it's for their bottom line?
Well, both. I'm sure they would all say both. When I ask, however, how do you know if you're succeeding? Most of them have said so far they have not had to answer for that. There's nobody at NPR asking their engagement editor for proof of success. There's nobody at the Chicago Tribune asking their outreach team for proof of success.
How about outside of journalism, traditional companies?
Well, Dell just built a whole social listening command center and staffed it with 12 people, so they clearly feel that it's an investment. The problem is that an outfit like Dell is used to measuring the effect of everything. Every department has a bottom line that they're contributing to, and every action and staff person is seen as part of an equation that leads to success. So this is just not a stretch for them. It's a stretch for journalists because we're not used to measuring the success of what we do. We're not used to knowing how many people read things. We're not used to knowing whether it made an impact. In general, the newsroom as a whole is either doing well or not doing well. Yeah.
When you talk about return on investment, can you go a little deeper in articulating your thinking? Because what I want to know is if you're thinking about that in the traditional financial way exclusively, or if it can be defined more broadly.
It can definitely be defined more broadly. One of the things we're trying to figure out, so next year I'll be back at the Columbia Missourian working on community outreach with them, and one of the things we want to do is work on the perception of the Missourian in town, know what that is, and then strategize around how we might change that, emphasizing things about the organization that people might not know. So you can survey at the beginning and end of a project and know whether that helps. So a change in brand perception is a kind of return on investment that might not be tied specifically dollar to dollar, but that clearly matters and impacts the bottom line. My knee-jerk negative reaction to conversations about ROI are that I think we're applying an unfair standard to all kinds of engagement strategies and not to the rest of our journalistic product and process. Yeah. Oh. The idea that we should, so ROI for social media, why should I invest in somebody to manage our social media? We think there should be a really clear answer to, if you do this, it will make you this amount of money. And we don't apply that standard to the rest of the newsroom. If you do this, it will make you this amount of money. Yes, sir.
Regarding some of the problems regarding some of the problems that you've talked about, not knowing your goals, to what extent do students, journalism or otherwise, give you hope that in a little while these problems will take care of themselves?
Well, that's a great question. I've been surprised since I started teaching here 7 long years ago by how traditional students can be. So I would not assume that because because students grew up consuming media differently, that they have different ideas about how it should be produced for current consumption. I get a lot of blowback from students when I talk about inviting the audience into the process and where our focus should be and making news decisions based at least partly on what people tell us they want to know and read. So I think I'm not sure that the student population in its approach to journalism is all that different than the other population. Some people get it, some people don't. But it's the real bridge we've got to cross over here is moving from putting on a hat as a media consumer and putting on a hat as a journalist. We've got to figure out how to act as journalists as if people are consuming media the way that we ourselves consume media. Okay, thank you very much.